Hello, I'm Pamela Berstler, CEO of G3 Green Gardens Group, and it's my pleasure to bring to you this introductory video for the California-friendly native plant landscape training webinar series. We're going to go through a little presentation, so bear with me while I share my screen. All right. So the first topic in our series is the California-friendly native plant landscape training. And all of this series is brought to you by the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. They're the water providers for more than 19 million people in Southern California. And you may not have heard of them before, but that's because they're the water wholesalers. It is Metropolitan that maintains the infrastructure to bring the water from distant parts of California and Colorado, California through the State Water Project, and Colorado through the Colorado River Aqueduct. And they bring the water here to Southern California, clean it and make sure that it is clean and reliable, and then they sell it to wholesalers, member agencies that then resell it to other agencies and to you directly for consumption in your home. So you don't really get to hear too much about Metropolitan, but they're behind the scenes making sure that that water is arriving on demand. And the thing about the Metropolitan water portfolio that I think is really interesting is that almost half of it is comprised of local water. Now, you don't really think about local water as being something in Southern California, but there is quite a bit of it in the ground. And that groundwater supply is something that gardeners can really affect because we can hold on to rainwater and actually improve the groundwater in our areas. In addition to groundwater, we have recycled water locally, and that's water that's taken out of the system, cleaned, and then put back into the drinking water system. By the way, when I use the term drinking water, I might occasionally use the word tap water or potable water, and they all mean the same thing. So groundwater and recycled water comprise a lot of our local water, but perhaps most importantly to us in our topic of conservation for gardens and for gardening is the water conservation component. Water conservation is super important because it creates a supply that is available immediately and to the entire system. And it's not just available to us to use, but it's also then made available to the environment. So conservation is a super important part of the water portfolio at Metropolitan and in Southern California. And that's something that gardeners can have an impact on, as you're about to see. So here in Southern California, when we have grass outside in our landscape, I think it's important for us to remember that every square foot of grass needs 4 feet of water to stay happy and healthy, which is quite a lot of water. As you move inland and you get closer to the desert areas, it could be more than 5 feet of water that's required. And as you get closer to the coastal region, it could be as little as 3 feet. But 4 is the average. And when you think about it, that's quite a lot of water that the grass needs in order to be happy and healthy. But one of the challenges that we face is that we apply the water to the landscape through an irrigation system, and those irrigation systems are very inefficient. In fact, only half of the water that we apply through those irrigation systems is actually ending up on the garden. Most of it ends up running off and doing no good. It doesn't benefit the plants in the garden or in the grass. So this is important for us to realize, because if only half of the water is ending up on the grass, that means we have to apply 8 feet of water in order to get the 4 feet that we need. So in reality, we are applying twice as much water to the landscape as what is actually needed by the plants. And it's because our irrigation systems are so inefficient. So this is a huge opportunity for us, not just to be thinking about, are there alternatives to having lawn in our garden, but also the way that we apply water to those gardens. I mean, if there were a way to be more efficient about it, we could save quite a bit of water. Now, the story that I'm going to tell you about California Friendly Landscapes is one that has quite a bit of research behind it. And I think it's important for us to keep in mind that it's not just about water that we're saving when we start creating landscapes like this. Actually, there has been a study that's been done that compares a traditional landscape with a more, what's called sustainable or California friendly or watershed wise, there are a lot of names for it, but the traditional landscape, which is covered mostly in grass, it doesn't have very efficient irrigation, it's not capturing rainwater. That landscape, when compared with a sustainable landscape of about 1,500 square feet, shows us that the traditional landscape is requiring as much as 57,000 gallons of water a year, which is quite a lot. Whereas the sustainable landscape is requiring about 10% of that, or 6,000 gallons of water. Then you go beyond water and you find that this traditional landscape has 670 pounds of yard waste that are generated every year out of that garden. And that has to be, taken and hauled away somewhere and used as landfill or composted. Whereas the sustainable landscape is only generating 250 pounds of yard waste. And the key there is that material can be used right on the property. It can be chopped up and dropped right in place or put into a small compost bin and recycled. So it doesn't have to be carted away. It doesn't have to be composted somewhere off-site. That's a really big issue. And it also has impact on all kinds of things like, air quality and so forth. So yard waste generation is another component of a California-friendly landscape. And a third component is that the traditional landscape is requiring someone to come every week and mow and blow stuff off of it and, kind of janitorial sort of work, requiring at least 80 hours of maintenance a year. Whereas the sustainable landscape is requiring only 15 hours of maintenance a year. And I think the thing that's important to remember is it's different kind of maintenance. It's not just janitorial. It's actually a lot of time managing that landscape, doing pruning and really kind of getting into it. So it's shorter, it's fewer visits for longer periods of time. And that's kind of a different paradigm for maintaining landscapes. So I think the point that I'm trying to make here is that even though the cost of doing these two kinds of landscapes is pretty much comparable up front, you're saving a lot of money and time and energy and having other benefits, multiple benefits for the environment by choosing the sustainable landscape over the traditional landscape that's covered in grass. Now, I want to make sure that you understand that we are not just talking about water conservation, because when we only talk about water conservation, you end up with things like this. And this garden is not a thing of beauty. And this is not what I'm talking about with a California friendly landscape. And neither is this. So we're not talking about rock covered gardens. We're not talking about bare earth. We're talking about this. We're talking about beautiful, verdant, plant-filled landscapes. And I think the most important thing here for us to remember is that a California-friendly landscape is not a sacrifice. It's about making a change in the way we think about landscapes and the way we value having plants over having just, green area. And the key here is, if you take a look at this picture, this garden, which has a lot more going on in it, requires 20% of the water that a lawn would require in the same place. So that's pretty huge. Now, one of the things that you're going to hear more about in the presentations is this thing called the watershed approach to landscaping. And I thought I'd take a moment to kind of recap what the watershed approach is all about. And basically what we're doing here is we're thinking about a watershed on a very large scale, and we're just kind of applying the same principles all the way down to the scale of our garden or our landscape, front yard and backyard, or maybe just even front yard. The key here is that we are looking at the way that water is moving through that landscape, and we're trying to find ways to hold on to water wherever we can for the benefit of the plants. And that's a really important rethinking of gardening, because a lot of the landscapes that we've created in Southern California have just been about doing something ornamental and making sure they're irrigated and then kind of setting and forgetting and going away. And now we're shifting back to a landscape where we're actually thinking about how it functions as a system. So a watershed approach landscape has some interesting things going on. First of all, the water's coming from the sky. And that's in the form of rain and fog and other kinds of precipitation. And when it does, it's grabbed by the plant leaves and held in the plants themselves. Some of the water is going to make it all the way down to the plants on the ground, and those plants are going to grab onto it. And as the water continues its journey, being pulled by gravity out of the atmosphere, it ends up onto the soil and it begins to infiltrate the soil. And infiltration means it's just going into the soil. And so the water starts moving through the soil. At some places, it may actually hit a place where it can't go any deeper. And so it begins a lateral movement. And what's actually happening here is the water is making a journey to a local waterway. That might be a creek, it might be a river, it might be the ocean. Eventually, all the water is moving toward a waterway, but water that can continue down through the soil and can percolate down into the root zones of the plants, and actually beyond the root zones of the plants, will find its way down into the water table. And when it gets to the water table, it actually fills all the pores of this soil and rejuvenates that water table, which is essentially water that's held in rock and in soil. And over time, that water is moving through the water table to the local waterways. Now, when the sun comes out, I'm going to make a happy sun here. When the sun comes out, that water begins to go back up into the atmosphere through a process called evapotranspiration. And evapotranspiration is just a kind of fancy word that describes the process of plants taking water out of the root zone and putting it up into the atmosphere as water vapor. It is broken down into evaporation, which is water leaving the soil, and transpiration, which is water leaving the plants and going into the atmosphere. And eventually, evapotranspiration ends up becoming clouds that form again over the land and bring the water back down onto the plant material, and the cycle continues. This is a happy, balanced watershed, and this is what we want to try to have going on in our landscapes everywhere. So let's move on. Actually, I have to make sure I clear that. There we go. Okay, so the 4 principles of the watershed approach are healthy living soil. So that's the first thing that we have to do. We create a sponge to hold on to water. Secondly, we create rainwater as a resource, which means everything that comes from the sky, we want to have it spend some time in our garden. The third thing is we are selecting climate appropriate plants. These are plants that are adapted to our climate, and they are also particularly local California native plants that are adapted to our climate where we are. And then finally, we want to make sure that the landscape is irrigated as efficiently as possible and only when necessary. The efficiency part is a description of how well an irrigation system is designed, how well it's installed and maintained and managed, how well that water is actually applied to the landscape. And the caveat of when necessary is really important, because this basically means that we're not just applying water because we can, we're applying water because the plants need it. And we have ways of determining when that is and making sure it's just the amount that the plants actually need when they need it. So we want to begin to think of every property as though it's a mini watershed. And that means that we're going to start looking at the top of the watershed up here, which may be the roof or it may be trees. And this is where the water is first coming from the sky and landing on these surfaces. And then we look at the bottom of the watershed, and the bottom of the watershed is where the water is actually leaving our property. And everything in between those two places, we have something to say about. So we can make choices to either do things that enhance our individual watershed, or we can do things that degrade the individual watershed. It's our choice. And so a California-friendly landscape is one that chooses to enhance that watershed. And the principles that we apply to create the healthy, balanced watershed is how we create a healthy, California-friendly landscape. The first component is healthy living soil. We're going to talk much more in the webinar about how you create a soil sponge. When it rains, we're used to throwing it away, but we want to find ways to hold on to it for the benefit of the plants. And this is a real thing. 1,000 square foot of roof will generate 600 gallons of water per 1 inch of rain. In a typical season of 10 inches of rain, that's 6,000 gallons of water from 1,000 square foot roof. That is a lot of water for a garden. If we could hold on to it in the landscape, we wouldn't need to irrigate nearly as much. We're going to select plants that don't require as much water as grass. I already said that in Southern California, we require about 4 feet or 50 inches really of water per year are required every square foot of grass. If we select plants that require less water, we are automatically putting ourselves into a position of conservation. So we want to start to think about, how do we find plants that are medium water users, which would require only 50% of the water that turf would require, or low water use plants that are 20% of the water, or very low water use plants that are only 10% of the water. If we make those choices in our California-friendly landscapes, we're going a huge way to saving water. I mean, think about it. Those very low plants, they're only needing like 9 inches of water a year, which is tremendous when you compare it with 50 inches for grass. Now, some landscapes are not going to get enough rainwater, or they might be a tad more thirsty than the rainwater that we've actually received in a given year. So in those cases, we want to have an irrigation system that's delivering water as efficiently as possible. One of the things for us to think about with these California-friendly landscapes is when we select local native plants, they actually have adaptations to summertime that make them go to sleep. So they don't need as much water in the summertime anyway. When they really need the water is if we've had a dry winter, and then they're going to need to have water applied to them so that they can make it through the long summer without requiring additional drinking. So that's our introduction to the California-friendly native plant landscape training. I hope you'll join us on an upcoming webinar. You can go to our website, which is greengardensgroup.com, and click on Turf Transformation to find the page with the link to the upcoming webinars, or you can also go to bewaterwise.com and find links there. There's also information about the turf replacement rebates, which are happening throughout Southern California. And these are providing money for removing grass and replacing it with California-friendly landscaping that follows the watershed approach. So I look forward to having you take a look at bewaterwise.com and also reading more about the watershed approach to landscaping in Southern California in the Waterwise Garden Handbook, coming soon at BeWaterwise and also on the Turf Transformation website with G3. Look forward to seeing you in one of the webinars.